Hey everyone, before we start today's episode, I wanted to quickly tell you about the membership drive that I am doing on patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to celebrate over 2 years of this podcast. If we hit the goal of 100 new supporters at $5 or more a month or $50 a year, I'll be able to hire a producer, which would give me more time to focus on the research and interviews and actually start releasing 2 episodes a week instead of 1. If you become a supporter, in addition to getting early access to all episodes, you will also have access to our monthly hangout, in which myself and everyone else who supports this project come together and chat about pretty much everything. It happens every month on a Saturday, and you have access to the link and everything related to that on Patreon. And lastly, if you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing this podcast with your friends and families and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. This helps get more exposure to this podcast and introduce it to more folks. You can also follow this podcast and project on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Substack, and of course the main website. So thanks again everyone, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
Hi everyone, my name is Wen Liu. I'm a researcher at Academia Sinica in Taipei, Taiwan, and also a part of the New Bloom magazine.
Hi, I'm Brian Hioe. I am a freelance journalist and translator. I'm also part of New Bloom. I'm also one of the editors.
Hi, I'm Romeo Kokriatski. I'm the managing editor of New Voice of Ukraine and the co-host of the Ukraine Without Hype podcast.
So thank you all three of you for coming on today. Romeo will be co-hosting this episode, although I think it's going to be just like a 4-way conversation. We're going to primarily be talking about a piece that Wen and Brian wrote for Spectre magazine called, the piece was entitled From Taiwan to Ukraine, Geopolitical Realignment and Anti-Colonial Solidarity in a Time of War. So, I mean, as the title suggests, we're going to be talking about Taiwan and Ukraine. We're also going to be talking about Hong Kong and Tiananmen, just because the commemoration of the Tiananmen massacre was just a few days ago, as it happens. And I think Hong Kong's been on our minds regardless, so it's kind of going to probably be touched upon anyway. So I guess I'll just start by asking you to kind of talk to us about the Spectre piece, like kind of what made you want to write it, what is it about, that sort of thing. And I will I'll just mention a quote that's in part of the piece because I find it very powerful, which is, "We must understand that the lessons Ukraine provides for Taiwan are not only about military preparation or security strategy, but about the problems of coloniality in geopolitics and political theory," end quote. So yeah, just kind of like introduce us to the piece, if that's okay. Wen and Brian, go ahead.
Sure, I'll start. So when the war broke out in Ukraine, there's a lot of interest in looking at the potential invasion of China, right, on Taiwan. And so in Taiwan, there are different kinds of discourses that were happening, right? So there were part of the more pro-Taiwan approach that argue that Taiwan should boost up its own security system. And there was also the sort of more pro-China discourse, right, that talked about how, well, the West will always fail Ukraine, just like how the West will always fail Taiwan. And within this discussion, Brian and I felt like there wasn't a lot that talk about the issues from a more leftist standpoint, right, that address the issues of Russia's imperialism, but also how the world is part of this capitalist system, and we can't only just think about the superpower competition. We have to think about the more sort of nuanced dynamics within it. And I'll say from my part, I wanted to write a piece because I think the issue when people talk about war in Taiwan, they tend to follow 2 different camps. One is this broader sort of new Cold War discourse. Obviously, gives agency to, the US and China, and Taiwan's often looked at as a chess piece, just like how Ukraine is often viewed. And there's another sort of similar discourse from, the international relations, geopolitical realism camp that would talk about, well, Taiwan, should take concession or, make peace with the geopolitical superpower struggle, and just let, the bigger superpower to decide the future of Taiwan. And obviously, both of these discourses are, reduce Taiwanese agency to those of the bigger nations. So I think the piece really wanted to highlight that Taiwan has a distinct history. It has dealt with colonialism for centuries, not only from China, but also from other different kinds of powers. So to talk about war in Taiwan, it's obviously an issue about China, but it's also not just about China. So I think that's kind of the broader backgrounds of the piece. Yeah, Brian wanted to add something.
Yeah, I think that particularly we're interested in the question of finding ways out for Taiwan. Similar to, I think, Ukraine in terms of being caught between great power competition. What is, for example, leftist solidarity that can try to kind of seek a path out for self-determination and so forth, and how to consider these broader issues. And so I think thinking about the kind of geopolitical ends, we wanted to discuss that in part because that is part of why I think Taiwan is significant for the US and China, but also global capitalism, for example, in terms of global supply chains, or Taiwan is talked of in terms of its importance to global semiconductor manufacturing, in terms of the shipping routes that pass around Taiwan and so forth. And so I think understanding the kind of relation of capital and geopolitics was important for us as well. And I think that insofar as all of this is part of this larger global discourse, particularly the threat of invasion facing Taiwan is now framed often in terms of Ukraine. And so this is interesting and how it happens both domestically, but also in terms of global international discourse about Taiwan. But then I think that while there are these parallels drawn, one can draw other parallels too. For example, that oftentimes when this is discussed in international media outlets and that kind of thing, you don't really have discussion of, for example, Ukrainian voices. It's talked about in terms of the US and Russia's interests. And that is, of course, parallel to how Taiwan is often discussed in terms of the US and China, but without consideration of Taiwanese voices. And then I think that one can point to this kind of larger relation with a much larger power that is nearby in terms of culture or politics and that kind of influence. So there's also further comparisons to draw between Ukraine and Russia and China and Taiwan in that way. And so trying to bring that out was something that we also wanted to do.
Yeah, as one was talking, the only thing going through my mind was, wow, this all sounds really, really familiar. I mean, it's you bring up these parallels, but like honestly, it is so shockingly close to the discourse that we have here in Ukraine that these parallels stand out all the more like starkly.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Even in the piece itself, you guys are, like, you write about how there's been this discourse first, which was a recycled version of the whole Hong Kong now, Taiwan tomorrow, and it ended up just becoming like Ukraine now, and Hong Kong, and Taiwan tomorrow. Um, I'm just curious, like from like what's been happening in Taiwan itself, in terms of like how has the past let's say 3 years, let's say since the latest Hong Kong uprising and the subsequent, and as of now worst, crackdown, um, has, and then I don't know, even maybe further on, like the events in Ukraine in the past few months, how has that affected Taiwanese politics itself in terms of the whole pro-independence versus pro-union, and has that shifted anyone's kind of have the, I would think maybe, for example, that people who were more pro-union with China are a bit more hesitant, maybe, or I don't know, but maybe they've doubled down. So, like, I'm very curious about those dynamics.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting in that respect because then Hong Kong it was used as a kind of. I think the reason why Hong Kong became such a big issue for Taiwan is because Taiwan can evidently see itself in Hong Kong's plight. And so a lot of these long-standing issues regarding the threat of Chinese invasion or independence versus unification, Hong Kong became a way to kind of repackage those issues, particularly in the lead up to the elections that took place in 2020, when you're deciding whether to vote for the DPP, the historically pro-independence party, or the KMT, the historically pro-unification party. And so Ukraine, I think, actually served a similar role in that these long-standing discourses that were kind of present in Taiwan are then repackaged in a kind of new way. And so this has become a political issue. I think people are concerned about the threat of Chinese invasion. There's increased discussion on what to do in the event of an invasion, lessons from Ukraine and that kind of thing. But then, for example, the Pan-Blue camp will say, well, you can't really say who's at fault here and that sort of thing. The Pan-Blue camp, that is to say the KMT and the pro-unification forces in Taiwan, they were much more hesitant to, for example, lean into supporting Ukraine. Eventually, they did make token statements, but that took that place after a while. Whereas the more kind of pro-independence camp would be more quick to support Ukraine because there's that kind of evident parallel there. And so it's kind of interesting then how I think that these external issues became a way to kind of think about internal issues long facing Taiwan. Before, for Ukraine, you had daily solidarity rallies in many cases, and the only last time that took place was with Hong Kong, that you had solidarity rallies occurring with such frequency that they would occur daily, for example.
Yeah, I just want to add that my observation is that since Hong Kong's anti-elect movement, the kind of pro-independence and pro-unification discourses have, how do I say, like polarized, right? So I think before that, I mean, folks are generally pro-status quo. I think actually most Taiwanese folks are, but the discourses have intensified in a way that the pro-independence crowd sees there's no way, right, that Taiwan could enter a kind of one country, two system idea, right? Because Hong Kong has shown that, I mean, that would never work, right, with the PRC. And with the sort of pro unification crowd, the general, I mean, it was under this Chinese cultural nationalism, right? You have to declare that you're Chinese, you're not Taiwanese, right? But afterwards, I mean, you see how the PRC demanded the pro-unification crowd to say we're actually anti-independence, right? 反台独. That becomes a newer discourse that was sort of being promoted by the PRC. So I think if anything, the Hong Kong now, Taiwan tomorrow, or Ukraine today, Taiwan tomorrow, that I think really, polarize the two camps.
Is there a growing sense in Taiwan that these pro-unification folks are becoming or acting as a sort of the fifth column for the PRC? Like, to take my example from Ukraine, our pro-Russian party, which was the largest opposition party prior to the war, have basically all turned out to be traitors. The ones who haven't been traitors have fled the country or have openly rejected that they ever were even connected to the pro-Russia side. So I was wondering if there is this kind of thought in Taiwanese politics as well that, it's probably not a great idea to have one of our main ruling parties be so intrinsically tied to our big scary neighbor.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, for example, the former KMT chair Hong Xiuchu was in China recently to visit Xinjiang and say there are no concentration camps. Everything seems fine. This is all in the name of anti-terrorism, and that these anti-terrorist measures are something to be praised. And so there's that kind of polarization. I mean, there are attempts within the KMT, as a pro-unification party, to kind of turn around the party's image, try to win back the support of young people, and come off as less pro-China. But I think that what's interesting, too, is that even if this is something that I think the more rational voices in the party are aware it needs to be done to win elections, even if they might not actually abandon those views, they just want to rebrand. There also is this kind of wing that is more ideologically hardline, and they've been kind of more vocal, particularly with events in Hong Kong and events that have happened after. For example, just trying to use this to sow doubt regarding the role of the U.S., saying that, for example, the U.S. or Western powers would only provide weapons to Taiwan, similar to Ukraine, it would actually never get directly involved. But then just kind of trying to paint this picture as though Taiwan's future still lies with China, but then saying that, well, it's not actually going to affect Taiwan's political freedoms in some way. But I think that some voices in the pro-unification camp have just become much more brazen about their views or their kind of idealistic view of China.
And going a bit further back, even Tiananmen, I mean, commemoration of Tiananmen is something that I knew about in Hong Kong. Obviously, it's something that was made a point of a number of times, that this is, Hong Kong was legally part of China, but was still able to do this thing under this whole one nation, two system thing. And I will also mention there have been a couple of recent pieces kind of reflecting on Tiananmen in a way that felt a bit different than previous years. Probably because of both Hong Kong and Ukraine. There's a piece by Wen Liu on New Bloom reporting on the commemorations that I want to talk about in that been happening in Taipei, which is what we're going to talk about now. But also just briefly mention that Promise Lee wrote a piece for I think it was for The Nation, and Long Yu, sorry if I'm butchering the name, wrote a recent piece for Lausanne as well. Can you talk to us a bit about the link between, or at least the politics of remembrance, let's put it that way, of Tiananmen, the Tiananmen massacre in '89, in Taipei, like in Taiwan more broadly, and has that changed as well in recent years?
So I think that's quite interesting too, because with regards to the events in 2019 in Hong Kong, after that, the commemorations of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which obviously took place in China, have been very much filtered through Hong Kong. And so this is very visible in, for example, that a lot of the commemorations are very Hong Konger led. There's one year it was basically just directly led by Hong Kongers, but now whenever there's one of these annual commemorations, which have been happening forever, you'll have like a Hong Kong moderator alongside a Taiwanese moderator. That's always a kind of deliberate choice. And then there are Chinese dissidents present or survivors of Tiananmen in some form, but they're not always the ones moderating, for example. And so that's kind of been a very interesting phenomenon. And so then the memory of Tiananmen Square, something that happened 33 years ago, is now filtered through more contemporary events in Hong Kong, and then that is posed as a potential future that Taiwan wishes to avoid in that case. And so that's kind of an interesting framing. But then with regards, for example, with the rise of localist identity in Hong Kong, you have the attempts to, for example, say that, well, Hong Kongers should not commemorate Tiananmen because this occurred in a different country. And so one also does see some of these trends in Taiwan, and particularly the article on New Bloom recently about the Pillar of Shame. It got into that kind of controversy because this is a sculpture that was originally present in the University of Hong Kong. It was demolished, so they tried to make a replica in Taiwan, but then that led to controversy because it's the Chinese name is more like National Pillar of Shame. And so which nation are we talking about then? Is it Taiwan, or is it China, or is it even Hong Kong in some sense? And so that raised these questions, and there's some contestation regarding that. But then it's interesting then because there's a controversy regarding the commemorations in Hong Kong of Tiananmen Square. But even with the commemorations, there's people saying that, well, some people believe that they shouldn't commemorate that. There was massive. There were like tens of thousands of people historically until very recently in which there were crackdowns. Whereas in Taiwan, this kind of identity debate has been going on much longer. And even if there's usually not as much controversy on a yearly basis regarding whether to commemorate Tiananmen or not, it only brings out a few hundred people. And so that size disparity is also quite striking here.
Yeah, I just want to add, I feel like the discourse of Chinese democracy has really changed a lot in the past 5 years, right? I mean, I think when Wen, the DPP president, was first elected in 2016, I mean, she did an interview and talked about, or someone, foreign correspondent framed her as the only sort of ruling president in Chinese democracy, right? But then I feel like 5 years was, 6 years from now, I mean, no one would look at Taiwan or Taiwan in that way as representing a Chinese democracy, because this ideal that there is one China or one Chinese society that's being carried from degrees or spectrums of the PRC, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, the link was really broken when, after the anti-elect movement in Hong Kong. So, and then for Taiwanese civil society as well, the younger generation of activists definitely do not see themselves as representing this ideal of Chinese democracy, right? So it's mostly thinking of it as a way of anti-PRC or anti-CCP ideology. So I do think there's some really interesting shift there.
Yeah, I think in that respect is quite interesting that, for example, the Chinese actors that you see at the Tiananmen commemorations in Taiwan, like they're people that have actually mostly been outside of Taiwan, been outside of China since Tiananmen Square. And so the connections with the kind of current generation of activists are not actually that strong, I think, in that sense sometimes. And particularly with Tiananmen Square, obviously, is commemorating the events that took place 33 years ago. But I think particularly in the past, it was much more possible to have exchanges between, for example, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China alike. But then this is not really possible nowadays with increased repression in China and Hong Kong, but also the effects of COVID and that sort of thing.
And sort of, sorry, Romeo, do you want to say something?
I just wanted to mention that, this again reminds me of when a imperialist superpower tries to enforce its cultural standard on its closest neighbors. It actually seems to have the opposite effect of pushing those neighbors away. Literally, all of Russia's talk of the Russian world and brotherly nations, that all went away the more Russia tried to impose it on us. And when Russia was simply existing and not bothering us, that's when those ties were the strongest. That's when people would happily identify themselves as Russian instead of Ukrainian or whatever. And it's really interesting to see the exact same dynamic play out, halfway across the world, where this repression of Hong Kong drives Taiwanese identity even further from some kind of pan-Chinese identity. I just find it really interesting that these hegemons keep making the same mistakes, and they keep acting in exactly the same ways.
I mean, on a much smaller scale, the example of Lebanon for me is Lebanon at some point was occupied by both Israel and Syria. And surprisingly, after the occupations ended, sentiments against the Syrian regime and Israel aren't very good, shockingly. And it's just one of those things. Again, the Syrian one especially was framed under I forgot what's the word actually in Arabic that they use. I think the translation would be something along the lines of um, oversight, or no, something like I forgot, but like something like along the lines of, like, again, brotherly nations. Like it's not this. We're not foreigners. We're just there to help out. That sort of thing. And it led to a massive uprising in 2005, calling for the expulsion of the Syrian troops. So yeah, these things happen a lot, and I'm sort of curious as well, kind of along those same lines of when we see as a response to this the rise of stuff like localism, as in my view kind of also very narrow-minded and short-term thinking, it misses out a lot of the potential, which is obviously in the spirit of this podcast, like the potential links and bond building that could actually occur between people. So again, in the context of Lebanon, a very easy example is Syrian refugees in Lebanon. You have about 1 million more or less in Lebanon right now. A lot of Lebanese still have no pro-refugee sentiments. They consider them just like foreigners and that sort of thing. There's a lot of xenophobic sentiments and racist sentiments. And I've even seen, and this is like even in context of like relatives and acquaintances and whatnot, people expressing anti-refugee sentiments by bringing up the Syrian regime's occupation of Lebanon, whereas those refugees have fled that exact same regime, essentially. But because it's framed in nationalist or localist, or whatever you want to call it, discourses, it's really us versus them, and the them can change at any time, basically, and there isn't kind of a deeper analysis of these things happening. And it made me think of that when you brought up let's say Taiwanese localists or Taiwanese nationalists or whatever. I don't exactly know the good terminology, so I'm being a bit vague about it. But like opposing, commemorating Tiananmen, or even opposing remembering Hong Kong, like as in 2019 stuff, that sort of thing, because, we're not the same nation, blah, blah, blah. It kind of misses out essentially the broader patterns, essentially. And ultimately, I think it risks actually playing into the hands of the imperialist powers or the regional superpowers who are trying to dominate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's very much the case. I think it's quite interesting, particularly regarding the discussion of Hong Kong refugees now in Taiwan, in the sense that I think there is a growing voice that would just consider them, well, like lost to China. They might as well be Chinese now because Hong Kong is controlled by China. Hong Kong citizens are subject to the same restrictions on political freedoms and so forth. And so there's discussion of like, well, Hong Kong refugees coming over, they could be spies or things like that. I think also particularly the Taiwan is not very refugee friendly, or doesn't have a real asylum measures in any way. And a lot of that's really framed by the memory of when the KMT came over from China. And so then it's like, well, we already went through this massive historical trauma because all these people came over, and that ends up framing contemporary refugee issues in a way that can be even with regards to people that are also facing threat directly from the PRC, for example, with regards to Hong Kong. Some of the same voices, for example, that were criticizing the pillar, that were also criticizing Hong Kong refugee measures, for example.
Yeah, I really see it as a problem of lacking of radical discourses in the context of Taiwan, right? So when folks in Taiwan have been indoctrinated by Chinese ethno-nationalism for decades, right? And all of a sudden, folks want independence, they want to express Taiwanese identity, and without a more sort of radical vision of sovereignty, it's really easy to latch onto another form of ethno-nationalism, right, which becomes anti-refugee, or in a slightly better way, like folks have been framing, I think the general sympathies for Hong Kongers, for Tibetans, and all the refugee from the PRC state is still high, but it's generally framed under the bracket of anti-communism. But obviously, as leftists, that can create another kind of red baiting problem, right? So I think our job, I mean, at least from New Bloom, is to think about really kind of putting into different discourses, right? That's so we don't get sucked back into anti-communism, Taiwanese ethno-nationalism, or worse, right, Chinese ethno-nationalism. But that's a pretty difficult task.
It seems to me that, what is missing is a sense of like simple solidarity. You'd mentioned earlier that, like 30 years ago, you could have PRC and Taiwanese and Hong Kong activists all sit in the room and break bread and chat about their respective problems. And it seems to me that kind of sense of just looking across to not even like halfway across the world, but just to your neighbor and empathizing with them has really gotten lost. Not just in your case, but I think globally over the past like 15, 20 years, that the idea that we are just people and it doesn't really matter what flag waves over our head, or at least the flags that are waving over our heads are causing us the same problems. Like I keep bringing up the eerily similar comparisons between Ukraine and Taiwan because I see the same thing here of people being unable to recognize that their struggles are the exact same struggles that people in Moldova are facing, or people in Belarus are facing, or the Russians themselves are facing, the Russian people. And it's a real mystery to me why this kind of loss of solidarity happened. And of course, developing it shouldn't be as difficult as it seems. These hyper localist movements should, I don't know, be easy to prove the absurdity of them. In considering we live in the most interconnected, globalized world in human history, it seems to me it should be really simple to smack a localist upside the head and say, listen, your problems are their problems and their problems are your problems. That's freaking obvious.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this isn't the perfect answer, but I think part of why this keeps on happening is a sort of a misunderstanding of what. Okay, I'm going to put it probably badly here, but the entire idea of an imagined community, Benedict Anderson, that sort of thing, is a lot of people don't understand that these are imagined communities. We sort of still take it for granted that there's almost like a essentialist idea of the nation state, and this is something that kind of defines a lot of things. If you start from that framework, then kind of the world is it's a puzzle that if kind of pieces that don't fit into it, then there's sort of aberrations that need to be fixed. And this is why I think that there are these inherently authoritarian ideas within such frameworks. And actually it segues a bit relatively okay. I'm very bad with segues of they're kind of talking about discourses, online discourses, and obviously I will bring up the more obvious ones first to sort of kind of get them out of the way, because I don't want to linger on too much about like people that we usually call tankies and that sort of thing. But I'm curious if you could at least speak about how you've been seeing Taiwan related discourses in those spaces, especially with regards to, or at least especially after, let's say, February and the most recent invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, I think regards to tankies is quite an interesting problem too, because, for example, we talk about the failure of solidarity in that sense. I think a lot of it really goes back to failure to go to the root of these issues facing us in various contexts worldwide, and they return to global capitalism or imperialism and those sorts of things. And oftentimes between major powers in the world, let's say the US and China or whoever, we see this kind of convergent behavior. But then for tankies, I think there's always this attempt to see an outside to global capitalism or imperialism, saying that, well, China or Russia are somehow leftist forces for good, and they are then idealized in very utopian terms, as though they were something completely qualitatively different from, let's say, the US. And so then you'll have, for example, tankies justifying placing actions in Xinjiang, saying it's completely different, or in Hong Kong, saying it's completely different, and they'll be criticizing the same actions in the US. I think there's this failure to kind of point to global convergences in terms of these actions. And I think that is one of those things. I think it's a desire to kind of uphold something completely outside of the context that they might be more familiar with. And I think that's another one of these issues with solidarity in that sense too, in that failure to connect on those lines and just to see how everyone is facing similar issues that have similar roots. And that's why these kind of struggles are they should be internationalist, or at the heart, these issues cannot be solved on a country-to-country basis.
Yeah, and also I think tankies in Taiwan have a specific characteristic of, I'll call it like reactive anti-Americanism. So obviously, I mean, we're critical of the U.S. empire, but with any information comes to their analyses, it would be the problem locates in the evil U.S. empire, right? And then obviously the U.S. empire is part of a lot of things, but by reducing all the complexity to U.S. empire, you really loses the nuances, right? And particularly in the context of Taiwan, the reaction against U.S. empire is often a form of their neglect of the Chinese empire, right? Because they don't want to talk about the Chinese threats, Chinese capitalism, Chinese imperialism. So they locate their radicality only in the form of a critique against the U.S. So I mean, I find that actually also very prevalent in academic discourses as well. So which is really frustrating.
So yeah, so the last bit is actually what I wanted, kind of the follow up, because I don't. It's not that I don't care about the tankies. I mean, they can be very annoying and they can do damage, and I have seen them do damage. When it comes to Syria, for example, the disinformation. I do think you can make the case that as willing vehicles of Russian disinformation in Syria, they have caused real life harm to, for example, the white helmets, who are like Syrian civil rescue workers. They've been now, if anyone kind of Googles the white helmets, among the first thing that you'll see is basically disinformation stuff. It's come to dominate. And what that does, and I'll just briefly say on that, like what that does is people who don't know that much about Syria, which is obviously most people, if they're just kind of curious or they're just looking something up and they find something like this, what it can do is it won't necessarily turn them into tankies, but it will kind of discourage them from exploring something further. Like it's just too complicated, it's maybe too scary, it's too unknown. It becomes this kind of abstract thing that becomes a bit too much. But the reason why I don't focus as much anyway on the specific tankies, like individuals and that sort of thing, with the exception of when they are large enough and you have suspicions of having wider links with like big governments, which is like a different kind of calculation, is that I do think to some extent tankies, or at least let's say tanky logic, let's put it that way, isn't as uncommon as it might seem. So that kind of like there's kind of a shade of things, right? You can be like a hardcore tanky, but I think you can make an argument that a lot of what they sort of feed upon, if that makes sense, is a stripping away of agency of folks like from Taiwan to Ukraine to Syria, for that matter, or what have you. And you can name many more examples, obviously, as well. Bosnians are familiar with this since like the 90s. This is something that a Bosnian friend, Adnan, who, I've been chatting about this, he's the one who's sort of pointing this out, that there's a lot of, for example, we can talk about tankies, which is one problem, but it's the Nobel Prize for Literature that gave the prize to a genocide denier 3 years ago, Peter Handke, who is like denies the Bosnian genocide. And so these are, the Nobel Committee they're not tankies, they're mainstream, quote unquote, liberal, whatever. And it's still considered relatively normal. It's something that I have been myself in situations where this is public information by now, but I had trouble with the University of Edinburgh when I was studying there a few years ago, because there was this one professor who is still in the news today. People can look him up. Because he, again, peddles in Russian disinformation and that sort of thing. And I called him out, and he complained about me to the department. It was kind of an entire thing. I ended up leaving that university anyway. But the argument that was given to me by the head of department at the time, sort of saying, like, this is a freedom of speech situation. You have your opinion. He has his opinion. Sort of thing. Again, head of department, not a tanky by. Probably he wouldn't even consider himself political or anything like that. But it's very common to see these things. And I think the irony is that it makes me think of a tweet by someone who I would not name, who I would definitely consider tanky, denies the genocides in Xinjiang, etc. That sort of the spiel at this point is very common, who said something like he was agreeing with Henry Kissinger on China. And he said something along the lines of, what he was trying to say is that even Henry Kissinger is to the left of the mainstream media, is what he was trying to say. But the irony is that he actually placed himself on the right of the mainstream media. This is something that irony is dead, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I definitely hear you there. I think there's this idea that if a topic becomes too complicated, especially in international politics, too complex, too nuanced, I think there's this kind of reactionary habit to just label the whole situation as they're all bad guys. They're all somehow guilty in one way or another, and therefore they neither deserve, my attention, and definitely not my solidarity. And you can just write off that whole thing. I think that's what tankies have very successfully done with Syria, is made the whole situation, and to a similar extent in Libya as well. They are trying to do the same in Ukraine with thankfully less success, but they have been successful in saying, well, there's so many factions and there's so many people involved, and look, the Islamists here, Islamists there, they're all terrorists, they're all bad. And this guy's good. Oh, he did some bad stuff. Well, it's a complicated situation. And generally speaking, this muddles the discourse enough that you get the kind of mainstream view of, oh, it's all super complicated, and that's why you could have different opinions, even if one of those opinions is denying genocide, and the other opinion is, no, there's literally a genocide here we have to address. I think that is very much the case here, and I think that is very much the case as well for tankies and authoritarians who deny Xinjiang is a problem, or say it's a necessary anti-terrorist movement. It's all just an attempt to make a pretty clear-cut issue, right? Concentration camps are evil, into something that is more questionable or malleable. So people go, well, this person says this person says this. Who can really know? Anyway, let's not pay attention to it. It always comes to me that the greatest threat to solidarity is not xenophobia, it is apathy. As it is in a lot of politics, apathy is typically the greatest enemy of whatever the value is, because when people don't care, they simply don't care, and they will actively protect their ignorance. They won't just wave it off. They will go out of their way to remain ignorant, because to learn about the nuances of a situation means to take sides, and oh my god, what if you take the wrong side? And this fear of taking the wrong side of something, having a bad take, as it's called, I guess, in modern parlance, I think really drives a lot of political instincts, especially across the masses of people who are mostly apolitical.
Mm-hmm. I want to hear your thoughts on this one, Brian. Before that, it made me think of, I did this episode recently with Fadi Bardawil, who's this kind of Lebanese intellectual and scholar. And he had this great piece, which is what we talked about on the episode, on Aimé Césaire, the Martinican political theorist who died some years ago, who was a member of the French Communist Party and then left the French Communist Party. And part of his kind of, I think it was his letter of resignation, it's some letter that he published later, I don't remember the details, spoke about what he saw as the problem in who gets to set the agenda, in what counts as a priority if you're a French Communist Party at the time. I don't remember which year this would have been. I think it was in response to the invasion of the after 56, the invasion of Hungary, but I might get the details wrong, so don't quote me on that. But who gets to set the agenda? Because if you're supposedly an internationalist party, if that's sort of your thing, there are still certain things that you consider priority and certain things that you don't consider priority. And what he was trying to make the case for, not just for Hungary, but I think he was talking about African liberation movements more specifically as well. They were not necessarily seen as a top priority, because a lot of there was at the time as well a lot of Communist Party people and other Marxists and some other folks as well, not just obviously as well, who were kind of dismissing them as petit bourgeois revolution, not important enough, or it doesn't fit all of the boxes that apparently count as a revolution, that sort of thing. And I think it says a lot that to this day, and I did an episode which I think will be out by the time this episode is out, with Nidal Bitari, who's the Syrian Palestinian activist, who spoke about how, as a Palestinian who's also Syrian, who grew up as a refugee in Syria, him being both anti-Assad regime and obviously anti-Israel and anti-Zionist, puts them in a very uncomfortable position at times, because there's lots of folks, especially in the West and in the diasporas, who would call themselves anti-Israel, but who have nothing to say about the Assad regime. And this kind of brings up a lot of different topics, and I won't kind of jump around all over the place too much, but it just says that often it's almost like it doesn't matter who is being killed or who is being oppressed, as much as who is doing the oppressing, like who is doing the repression. And this is where people kind of like, if Israel is doing the repression, okay, well, this fits in a certain story, we kind of know it, it's familiar, blah blah blah. But if just across the border, which is occupied by Israel for that matter, and across the Golan Heights in Syria, if the Assad regime is doing the kind of same kind of repression, and sometimes even worse kind of repression, it doesn't fit any kind of pattern. It doesn't fit there are no flags that I'm that familiar with, or the slogans aren't that familiar with, and so I don't participate in it as much. And this is a problem. It's a real problem that I think has affected a solidarity network in the Arab world, in the diasporas, and this is just like the example I'm giving, but it's something that I've seen kind of repeated time and time again. I'll quickly give another example on Tigray. Recently, this episode is already published. I had an episode on Tigray, and with a Tigrayan academic who was able to kind of speak to this nuance as well. Like, Tigray, legally, it's part of Ethiopia, so it's part of a nation state that's already well established. The borders aren't kind of debated in international law or what have you, but it's basically been the subject of an ongoing campaign of genocide. And this puts a lot of or should demand kind of solidarity from, let's say, Pan-African folks or what have you. But for the most part, they've been quite silent because of Ethiopia's, legacy as kind of the center, that sort of thing. So I'm jumping all over the place here just to kind of emphasize that I'm seeing different parallels. They're not the same. Those are not the same situation. Local context matter a lot. But as, Romeo, you mentioned before, like it feels that by now it should be a bit easier to go beyond these kind of limitations. Sure, language is sometimes a limitation, although these days English is becoming easier for most people, but not for everyone. It's becoming, it feels like it's getting there. Maybe it would be the optimistic take, but not quite there yet.
And honestly, this is what I wanted to ask you guys as well, especially on this idea of, well, if you are anti this and anti this, you have no friends kind of thing, because I think this is a situation that I, as a Ukrainian leftist, am super, super familiar with. And I think you guys, as Taiwanese leftists, can probably also relate. How do you approach the incredibly complex and I would say, I mean, personally for me, even uncomfortable question of the fact that our safety, I mean, in Ukraine's case, quite literally, we are surviving because the West is sending us guns. At the same time, the US is a giant evil empire that is, we can see not just creeping towards fascism in real time, but jogging towards it at a pretty respectable pace. And I often struggle with how I approach that relationship, as a leftist, as someone who is anti-imperialist, but my physical safety is at the moment literally guaranteed by an imperial state. And I think you guys might be able to shed some insights here.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll jump in. Yeah, I think it's one of those things. I think the issue is that there's just no kind of moral purity or no moral high ground here in that sense. And so I think survival then what compromise are entailed, or I think in terms of thinking about long-term and short-term goals, I think that's part of the issue. I mean, as leftists, I think that, obviously we need to be critical of the US at the same time. Then we end up in this kind of odd relation in which we have some kind of military relationship where the US is backing, for example, forces in Taiwan, just as to say militarily in terms of arms sales and that sort of thing. But then I think also the question is, let's say, for example, for Taiwan, which has had a history of anti-communism, for example, as propagated by the KMT, which is now the Pro-Unification Party. However, they were historically a military dictatorship backed by the US. With this kind of legacy there, if you are a leftist and trying to then clear the ground for pushing for leftism in Taiwan, then you're just saying, well, we're just going to criticize the US and not even care about these concerns about how do we survive in the face of Chinese aggression. And that's all you talk about. You're not exactly going to win over members of the public in that way. And so I think that in terms of thinking about how to really kind of shape public perceptions of leftism. I think particularly for us in New Bloom, I think one of our critiques of, for example, the pro-invasion left in Taiwan, who are, let's say, Taiwanese people that are mostly criticizing the US and not really criticizing China, is because I think to really gain ground for leftism, then you actually have to kind of find this critical position and show people that this is what leftism is or should be about, actually having this position that is critical of both the US and China, not just really siding with one versus the other.
Yeah, and I also think definitely I think Ukraine's case have gave a lot of the fruitful thoughts. I mean, same in the Spectre journal. I mean, there were a lot of the feminists who signed a statement that basically argue for an anti-war position that does not support Ukraine's military, and I was really disappointed by that. But the way I think generally leftists think about war is the war that the U.S. is engaging in, and for Taiwan, it often being compared to Israel, right, the state of Israel. But I think the nature of war is really, really different. I mean, between obviously Taiwan and Israel, when Israel is actively initiating occupation and colonialism in a different country, while Taiwan is asking for enough armed sources to be able to be self-sufficient and to defend imperialist aggression. So I do think there's a qualitative difference there. So by lumping them all into this discourse of anti-war is really, first of all, not fair and just not the right analyses there. And secondly, I think what New Bloom and also Lao San has been trying to do is that we're hoping to connect with the U.S. progressive movement as well. So you're not thinking about the U.S. as this giant flat piece with only Trump and the white fascists, right? There's a lot of folks of color and activists are working against fascism and thinking about a more radical vision of the U.S. as well. So I think we wanted to bring that vision to the Taiwanese society as well. So we are not only looking at a certain version of the U.S., but we're also supporting U.S. activists who are actively fighting against, the fascist tendency, right? I think only in that way, only in that way that true, international solidarity can happen.
And ultimately, another thing that has really occupied my thoughts of late is, what do we do, like, if and when the U.S. does just mask off complete Christian theocratic fascism? Like, what do we do then? Is my question, because again, my safety right now is being assured by U.S. heavy weapons and the U.S. military industrial complex. Taiwan is often said to survive simply because the U.S. Pacific Fleet is there. Whether that's an exaggeration or not, that is the common perception. So as the U.S. turns and develops and adopts more of these fascist policies, what do we do and how do we respond to that? And what can we do even? Is it even realistic to think of this question in that term?
Can I'm always kind of brought back to the example of the Spanish Civil War, and at some point in the first few months they were sort of left alone to their own devices, and they were as in the anarchists and the communists were kind of resisting with weapons that they were getting from either kind of quasi-sympathetic states, or at least people within those states or whatnot. But eventually they did get the support of the Soviet Union, which was obviously under Stalin at the time. And this came with a lot of strings attached, notably having to put the photos of Stalin in every kind of corner, that sort of thing. And, this was in a context where not that long after that, after the crushing of the Spanish Civil War, Stalin and Hitler did the notorious pact, obviously, which was then violated by Hitler not that long after either. But this was in a situation where if you're under the bomb by both, Franco and Mussolini and Hitler, Franco was obviously supported by Hitler and Mussolini. And the only thing that's sort of there, because they did try and get weapons from the Brits and they did try and get weapons from the French. And if I got my timeline correct, I get lost in the details, but they did at one point get it from the French and then it stopped and then it came. So it was very kind of inconsistent. and the only kind of other player in town, so to speak, was Stalin, essentially. And so those were people that a lot of them were not even wouldn't see themselves as kind of state communists. They would see themselves as anarchists, and even the communists who would call themselves communists would not necessarily be Stalinist, and they had to kind of contend with that reality. So I think it would be an interesting case study, because obviously in that case they lost in the end, and the bombing of Guernica and the rest of Spain and Catalonia and that sort of thing. I think the rest is history, as they say, and the loss of that struggle, the loss of that territory, you might say, to be more pragmatic about it, was one of the catalyzing factors that led later to the pact between Stalin and Hitler, and then again the rest is history. So parallels are there. They're not the same, as again it's not perfect. For one, America is much more diverse in that sense than the Soviet Union was, at least in the political sense at the time, not in the ethnic component sense necessarily, but in the sense of people who see themselves as Americans but are not white, for example, and the influence that they have is a bit better, I guess I would say, than 100 years, something that happened about 90 years ago. So yeah, that's what sort of I would say. But I guess the short answer that I would give is that probably it will depend on the situation, and if you don't have a choice, well, then that's your answer. You don't have a choice. That's sort of the Palestinians who have had to struggle against the Israelis for several decades have gotten weapons from everywhere. Like at some point, there was one group that got weapon from fucking North Korea. There was one point that got it from the Assad regime. One point got it from Saddam, and they were actually opposed to one another, and that created other kinds of conflicts. But what else would you do? And by the way, the Israelis got recognized by and supported by the Soviet Union, I should say, something that the tankies do not like to talk about. But anyway, so that would be my take. I don't know if you guys have like something else to add. Feel free to do so.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Particularly, I think that, for example, in Taiwan, there are a lot of people that are banking on the U.S. for support for Taiwan, but then what happens is they then idealize the U.S. and so they really turn a blind eye to this kind of creep towards fascism or this mass violence from gun shootings that you see in the U.S. And I think that's a really dangerous tendency. And so, like, particularly, I think then, as a leftist, then I think also it's worth showing people, I think, particularly in Taiwan, what is actually going on in the U.S. I think just a lot of times people are just turning a blind eye to it or not aware of it sufficiently. I just think historically it ties back to long-standing attitudes in Taiwan because Taiwan was backed by the U.S. for so long, and that contributes to this kind of general idealization of the U.S. or the West as it was superior or better in some sense. And I think that's problematic, and I think that's worth clarifying.
I'm actually curious. There's kind of maybe a bit of a tangent, but it's just kind of, humor me here. We know that there are lots of folks in the West, let's say when it comes to Ukraine, who talk about Ukraine as, it's an outpost of the West, right? Like they're defending our values and they're fighting, this power, what have you. And it's not as much about the specific of the specific struggle or the specific cause, but it's more about these kind of wider, let's call them abstract, Fukuyaman kind of frameworks of the world. And with Taiwan, Westerners who think along those lines don't consider Taiwan a Western nation, obviously. And it's kind of, they would have the same kind of attitudes towards Japan. Obviously, it's like, okay, it's not a Western nation, but it's like, it occupies this space where it's like almost, but not, that sort of thing. And with Ukraine, it's sort of, with all of Eastern Europe, I would argue, with the obvious notable exception of Russia, there is this sense of, yes, now we kind of include them within our circle of empathy, if that makes sense. But it's, as we've been seeing, that even with the case of Ukraine, we still see a lot of comments from German politicians, notoriously these past few months, but also like French and Italians. And I will say, like, this is on the public record and it's super random, but when I was in Beirut, I accidentally met the Norwegian ambassador at a cafe, just a completely random thing. I didn't even know he was the ambassador. I thought he was just some politician. And he started talking pretty casually, which probably he shouldn't have. But he started saying at some point that it's not very uncommon for diplomats to say that Ukraine should cede, for example, Crimea and the Donbass, as if it's them to decide, like as if it's their decision in one way or another, or at least that they are allowed, essentially, that they have the right to have an opinion on this, in a way that if you're talking about whether you should give up, I don't know, Marseille or Paris or Manchester, those are no-brainers. This is just not something that can ever be allowed. But somehow, at some point, it's almost like there's a, the more you go in the periphery, so to speak, as a term I like to use, which I've mentioned a number of times. I've got from Mangal Media, and I've written about it in Lausanne as well. The more you go into kind of peripheral, not even nations necessarily, but peripheral spaces, the less you're worth, essentially. I'll just put it that way, I guess.
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. I think just sometimes this notion of like, well, the logic applies to center, doesn't apply to the periphery somehow, in terms of even like morals or what have you.
It was really weird to me because when you were saying, oh, people don't think of Taiwan as the West, in my head I was like, what? They don't? Because to me, Taiwan is a Western country. It, like, beyond the obvious facts that it's a liberal capitalist democracy, it's aligned with the US politically. The US literally has a basically implicit pledge to defend Taiwan. Taiwan is the home of like a good chunk of the world's advanced technology manufacturing. Like, in what way is Taiwan not a Western country, or Japan not a Western country?
Well, in a racist way. this is what I was trying to get at, is that at the end of the day, you feel like, and it's something that's sometimes implicitly stated or not so implicitly stated. It's more like, it's like West plus, like there's West and there's West plus, that sort of thing, in a way that Australia or New Zealand are not in West plus, right? Like they kind of fit the same kind of patterns, as or same kind of criteria, if you want, as South Korea or Japan or Taiwan or what have you. But it's sort of not really, there's no debate there. There's no ambiguity there, right? Like, if there is kind of an alliance between the UK and Australia, it's just, yeah, of course there will be, even though they're opposite side of the world. But of course there will be, because they're both Western nations, like this whole, and the Five Eyes thing, which I think does include Japan, or I'm not exactly, but the entire thing, like there's just kind of this ambiguity in that sense, which is, it gets interesting for all the wrong reasons as to what counts as they're on our team, so to speak. Because if there is kind of, if it's conditional, right? If it's conditional, and we're seeing this with Ukrainians now, and this is what kind of worries me. I live in Switzerland, in Europe, and I've seen discourses, of course, and I guess it goes without saying, there's been a lot of racist discourses, as in like not extending that same kind of sympathy or empathy, for that matter, towards like non-Ukrainian refugees, Syrians, Afghans, what have you. I mentioned this on the podcast a number of times. But even besides that, even specifically with Ukrainians, I'm not entirely sure that Ukrainians in Europe, in Western Europe specifically, may be safe forever. Like the whole anti-Eastern European discourses is very common in Western, like it's super common in every single TV series. There's a bad guy who's like a vaguely Slavic or Eastern European or whatnot. In the UK, the discourse against Poles and Romanians was worse at some point than discourse against Muslims or Syrians or what have you. So like, this is what I mean. Like, they're kind of part of us, they're part of our team, but maybe they're not our favorite members of the team, right? Like this, it's conditional. This sort of what I was getting at.
I will say that I am very one thing that does harm me in that sense is the very active, and I guess some people might even say overactive, efforts of the Ukrainian government to position Ukraine as not just a member of West Plus, but as currently the heart of the West. People are calling Zelensky like a leader of the free world now, and things like that, which I really like, because it does flip that narrative kind of on its head. It's like, oh, your media portrays all Slavs as like bad guys, and all you see us do is like clean hotels and like build stuff. But actually, here we are. We're the guys actually like bleeding for democracy. We should be what the model that you guys aspire to, instead of the other way around. And honestly, I think that should extend to Taiwan and a lot of other so-called periphery states as well, because in a lot of the times, these are the countries where a democracy is the most fluid, where political change is the most possible. but also because this is where conflict occurs. Obviously, conflict occurs on the periphery, right? Almost by definition. And as a result, people have to take a stance. They cannot be apolitical or apathetic. They have to take a side. When there is physical conflict or material conflict going on, people have to choose what they support and what they don't support. And as a result, that really galvanizes just general political awareness, setting, kind of exemplifying what certain members, certain people in the West like to call the quote unquote Enlightenment values.
Yeah, I just want to say it's an interesting conversation because I do think that Taiwan has so much potential. But as long as our country's official name is Republic of China, I think it has all this burden, right? Claiming attachment to this idealized nations of China. So I think it just signified that Taiwan really still has a lot of internal issues, right, around decoloniality, right? I mean, Brian has written about that we wanted to take down all the Chiang Kai-shek's memorial sites, and there's a lot of resistance from within Taiwan because the memories of past economic development associated with him were so great, right? And we still have, the grandson of Chiang Kai-shek, right, or that wanted to run for Taipei mayor. So all these different things, issues of past authoritarianism, is not completely resolved. And I just wanted Taiwan to play in these conversations about internationalism and about peripheral and the center. But obviously, we still have all these issues ahead.
Yeah. To quickly add on that, Romeo, you mentioned how it's Zelensky be kind of spoken about as the leader of the free world and whatnot. I mean, with all of the cringy aspects of that, doesn't matter. But it makes it also very uncomfortable for politicians who do see themselves as the leaders of the free world. Like it makes it Macron. We've seen many times trying to kind of cosplay Zelensky basically, and it's gotten. Like if you've been in a coma for the past 10 years, I think things will be it's like Goodbye Lenin, that movie. Like things will be very confusing right now, I think. And there is an element of, we've seen that in many ways a good chunk of the difficult, I mean, I've described this on Twitter I think a few days ago, like Ukrainians aren't just fighting Russian imperialism, which they are first and foremost, but they're also kind of fighting or struggling against, in some sense, European cynicism. And we've seen this a lot. There's like a huge tendency to say, like, don't stop bothering us so much, like don't touch our toys, we don't want to give you things, we don't want to disrupt our economy too much, we can do things here and there. And again, this does remind me of when, again, parallels are not perfect, but during the Spanish Civil War, the French, who by the way were led by a socialist at the time, were not that keen on giving too much. Like there was a lot of backs and forth, and this disrupted the flow. And again, France and Spain literally have a border, so this would have actually changed the course of things quite significantly. And so this, what I'm trying to say is that often, and this is something that obviously both tankies and people who kind of subscribe to kind of a Fukuyaman worldview, what have you, or the Kissinger folks or whatnot, this, what they often miss is that it's often much more mediocre, even if I may put it that way, than how it's portrayed. Like the fact that in Germany there's still a debate about which ones to send and how to send, and maybe we'll send it by winter, and we don't want to disrupt our economy too much, even though we're one of the most powerful economies in the world, and clearly they have the capacity to cut off Russian gas if they had really, really wanted to properly, not just the second one, but the first one as well. Who knows what that could have done in terms of impacting Russia's capacity by now? Like it's pretty massive amount of money being sent by the EU on a daily basis to this day, as we're speaking, to Russia during the over 3 months in after the start of the most recent invasion. So it's like you're not debate. People who have these debates online often think of like all of the powers are like equally ambitious, and they all have kind of rational thinking, and it's all about like kind of they're applying a invisible market logic, if that makes sense, to geopolitics as well, which we know doesn't work with the market. It does not work with geopolitics either. And so this is sort of what I'm often trying to get at, is that when you do speak to these ambassadors and politicians, which I sometimes do as a journalist, they're not as gung-ho about most things as you might think. They're actually trying to maintain whatever their lives is today. They just maintain it for tomorrow, and it's often not that more complicated with deadly consequences. But that's what I mean, like the deadliness of mediocrity, essentially, is what I'm trying to get at. Okay, so the kind of there's at least one main thing I wanted to kind of get us into before we sort of wrap up, and you can have kind of final thoughts and then get into the book section and whatnot, which is that in the Spectre piece, you write, and I'm just going to read here a bit for a few seconds, if that's okay. So you write, apologies for the Chinese Empire in Sinophone discourse. Sinophone, for those who don't know, is like Chinese-speaking discourse, have sometimes taken their cues from Western leftists who sought to redirect blame exclusively back to the West. And when you mentioned this a bit, often citing arguments drawn from Western leftist apologists for Russia. These apologists and their Western leftist accomplices frame the West as the only actor to criticize and Russia's actions as a legitimate response to NATO aggression. Again, something we're super familiar with at this point. Whether they do so out of ignorance or out of a sense of guilt about Western imperialism, the result is to absolve non-Western imperialisms, in this case Russia, of its agency and culpability for the horrors it has wrought in Ukraine, end quote. So I'm kind of interested in these dynamics because, I mean, I'm obviously very interested and invested in disrupting them. And I'll give the example quickly, if that's okay, of Russia-Syria discourse. I brought it up a bit when it comes to the white helmets, and how I think you can make the argument that it has led to concrete harm. Like if this information was an actor and there was an international tribunal and whatnot, I think you would be trying that actor as a complicit part of the media apparatus during a campaign of extermination, which we know, for example, during the Bosnian genocide, a lot of state outlets run by like Milosevic were active components, and obviously in the Rwandan genocide is a pretty notorious case as well. So in the case of Syria, and I think we saw this parallel with Ukraine after 2014 as well, but in Syria I think it really intensified at one point because it happened around the same time as the ISIS attacks in Western cities. And so the discourse was really able to kind of be married almost by convenience, essentially. And the way it was kind of working is that the Russians would often have multiple different discourses at the same time. Sometimes contradictory, sometimes they don't make much sense. Sometimes they're literally, quite literally, just copy-pasting blog posts by some random Westerner who wrote something somewhere and posted it on social media, and publishing them, posting them, what have you, and then because they have multiple media outlets, using those media outlets as the sources for other media outlets. So let's say written something on RT or on Sputnik or on some other website or Gray Zone or what have you, and then RT would cite Sputnik, or RT would cite Gray Zone, or Gray Zone would cite what have you. It becomes kind of thing, or they just cite someone who's online or what have you, and it gives off this idea or this ambiance, if you want, that this is something to be talked about. Like this is, so many people are talking about it, it's going viral, and so this is now a discourse that we need to engage on. And with Syria, what's kind of been incredible is that the Russians did not need to do much because of existing Islamophobia, the existing war on terror. We see this with Xinjiang as well, specifically. They didn't need to do that much to kind of either scare away some people who might otherwise be interested, or fully persuade people that they are fighting ISIS and whatnot, even though at the time they were actually bombing the Free Syrian Army and not actually bombing ISIS while the Free Syrian Army was attacking ISIS. But those are the details that don't that they're not very important in the memeified culture online, essentially. So I'm just curious, like from your, or at least what can you tell us about how this information has been working either in Taiwan only or in Sinophone spaces more broadly? Because I think you mentioned in that piece as well that the kind of calling all Ukrainians Nazis and that sort of thing is actually super prevalent in those spaces. And, it's something that, so what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting in regards to disinformation, because it's definitely this thing where websites citing other websites creates credibility for this kind of network then that develops. And that's one way you kind of reinforce disinformation claims. So I mean, I think that you see some ties with pan-blue politicians, particularly the pro-unification camp, effectively, that are really hardline, and they take kind of their cues from China in terms of its messaging. And I feel like sometimes they're kind of waiting for how China frames things before they make any statement, because they are acting as China's proxies in Taiwan, and so therefore they want to be on the same page in terms of rhetoric. But I think in terms of Taiwanese media outlets, sometimes they're also not very good at fact-checking. This is an incident in which Taiwanese media has sent journalists to Ukraine. They're usually on the Polish border, so they don't always go in. And this is actually pretty unusual, I think. You usually don't have Taiwanese outlets sending people to war zones effectively. And so there's that at the very least. But I think particularly from the left, what is interesting is some of the more pro-unification left outlets, they translate Western outlets and their commentary on Ukraine as though this is more credible. And it's actually kind of an interesting way in which they are always lashing out at U.S. empire, but oftentimes their rhetoric is actually coming from the U.S. and they import it mechanistically into Taiwan, but then it's only in the services of effectively reinforcing Chinese nationalism. And so, for example, they would translate like Progressive International, Mint Press, Counterpunch as well. And so some of these outlets, I mean, sometimes they do put out publications that are, I mean, some of them are just tankies, and some of them put out things that are kind of tanky-ish. And then this ends up in Taiwan, and it's imported as discourse in that way. That's been an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, I see. Interestingly, with the Sinophone context that's being developed recently, is that criticizing China is equate to a form of xenophobia, and that is, I think, a super powerful discourses. I mean, both in Taiwan, but also in the States or in Western discourses, right? Because Westerners do not want to be seen as racist, right? So with the case of Xinjiang, with the case of Taiwan, a lot of people are afraid of siding with both of these, peripheral society, because they see that as being framed as an active aggression against China, and hence a form of racism, which is a really powerful tool. And with the rise of the anti-Asian hate idea, it's all being packaged by Beijing as a kind of xenophobia. Also happened in Taiwan. The more sort of pro-China folks talked about Taiwan's rejection of mainland Chinese entering into the Taiwan border during the pandemic as a form of xenophobia. So all these discourses become really messy. And I see also a second sort of way in which this disinformation can work in the Sinophone context, the fundamental disagreements on how we view sovereignty, right? So you have the PRC claims Taiwan as a natural and inseparable state as part of the China. And you have all these Western companies like Zara and all these big corporations backing up, right, China's claim by, in everyday discourses, right? Like you want to order something and you see Taiwan as part of, Chinese province. And a lot of the European states still view Taiwan as a part of province, and all these sort of everyday method that claim Taiwan as a not, illegitimate state. I mean, you must see a lot of parallels to how Ukraine has been viewed, right, by Putin, right, to see it as basically an accident or a mistake by Soviet Union or whatnot. So that really creates a lot of confusion and hence disinformation that happens in our context.
Yeah, I was gonna ask Romeo directly if any of this sounds familiar.
It somehow strikes a chord with me. I don't know what it could be, but for some reason I keep thinking, this, I feel like this is something I'm going through right now. Yeah, I mean, it really just goes to show how our problems ultimately are the same. Like, yes, there's local context and nuance, but the tactics used against us and and when I say the tactics used against them, I mean like the imperial rhetoric, imperial actions to try and subordinate what they see as their territory. It's from the same playbook. They don't. There's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing creative. They all do the same things, and as a result, our responses also tend to dovetail because, well, there's not too many ways to approach something like this. And because of that, it really should be easier to build international solidarity than it seems like it is. It really seems like It should be, like I said earlier, fucking obvious. We are facing the same issues. The person doing the oppression or doing the imperialism might be different, but even they're aligned. And as a result, like, you would think opposing building these transnational connections would be like one of the most important parts of developing a vibrant left political space, or creating a viable left political space in any of our nations. Because showing that, listen, we're not just talking out of our ass, we're not just like inventing this. We are facing this problem. Ukraine is facing this problem. Um, like, Palestine is facing this problem. Everyone in the situation facing imperialist aggression is facing the exact same problems. And I think I think this has gone very much underemphasized in the current kind of left's trend, especially in the West, of being hyper local, hyper focused on domestic issues. I think this has very much been lost, and as a result, it is actually become harder to sell leftist ideas than otherwise. Because when you point out that ultimately, it doesn't matter what your neighbor looks like, he has the same shit problem as you, well, you can start talking to your neighbor and trying to figure out a solution from there. Otherwise, trying to repair everything individually is probably not going to work out.
I think to some extent we're still coming out, and it's very frustrating that we haven't come out faster. But I think we can make the argument that we're still coming out of a sort of a post 90 Fukuyaman, and again, I know I mentioned Fukuyama, but I was just like, as in a shorthand. But like, this is how the world is. This is the world order. This is just how things are. And anything that doesn't fit that sort of gets either discarded or just not thought about that deeply. And with like post-Soviet space in general, a lot of it has just been, we're not going to think about that anymore. Like I'm saying, like people in the West, it's too complicated. It's no longer quote unquote communist, as if the Soviet Union counted as communist in that sense, or at least state communist, I suppose. But, it's no longer us. It's no longer our thing. We quote unquote have lost, and therefore we're kind of confused now. And some of it is also post 2003 stuff, post Iraq invasion of Iraq stuff, which again by now I think we should have moved on faster. But we know, for example, in the Arab world, we know that the post 2003 stuff, the invasion, subsequent occupation, has definitely informed a lot of how Westerners, especially, and maybe leftists, not just in the West but across the world, have viewed Libya, have viewed Syria, have viewed, at best of times they don't know the difference between those countries anyway. And it's easier to kind of, it's all an imperialist thing, and it's sort of conspiracy. It's sort of color revolution, basically, to use terms I think Putin himself has used. And we know that Putin is supposedly kind of was quite concerned by how Gaddafi ended up, and that supposedly informed some of his later thinking or whatever. And this is something that I think a lot of people, let's put it bluntly, did not want to think about Ukrainians and Taiwanese and Bosnians and Uyghurs. It's like it's too complicated. It just messes up the picture so. Or Rohingyas for that matter, and then after Rohingyas, actually, just like other Burmese and other people from Myanmar resisting the coup, for example. It's too complicated. And so when it gets too complicated, as you said, Romeo, before, a lot of people would want to just go back to simpler boxes and simpler, categories and that sort of thing. And I think this is what we sort of need to be, fighting against, or at least pushing against, because especially in this age where attention spans are like 5 seconds long on social media, it can lead to a lot of the mediocrity I described before, essentially kind of running the show. And sort of on that note, I would ask each of you, if that's okay, to sort of, I don't know, wrap up or kind of give us some final thoughts or what have you. And after that, I'll ask our two guests to recommend 3 books, as I often do on this podcast, if that's okay. So I don't know who wants to start with kind of final thoughts or that sort of thing. When you can start if you want, and then we'll go with the others.
I feel like, I think this is a really great conversation because it just, shows how similar a lot of these post-colonial states are, and we share the same fates and same struggles. And so I think it's important that we have conversation because the obstacle that Taiwanese have is actually not that unique, right? And then I think that's why international solidarity is so crucial. And another point I just want to raise, also folks have raised in this podcast, is that yeah, we must listen to those who are facing the struggles. We can't just apply to those easy and broader frameworks that reduce the agency of the peripheral states, like from Ukraine, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Xinjiang.
Yeah, I guess I'll go next. I think these conversations are very important because I think particularly to resolve these issues, it requires thinking across borders and not just on the standpoint of nation state to nation state. And so finding points of commonality as well as shared issues is very important. But I've also been thinking about this recently. I think particularly when we do discuss, for example, internationalism, sometimes actually it just becomes within like a region. It's like this region and the countries are by you. But then I think also discussing between regions, for example, as here, not just like whatever, like Asia Pacific, but thinking about just how actually these are very global. And this, actually then I think having this kind of discussion that just is really international in this sense allows for shedding light on how these phenomena are global and structural and rooted into the kind of current society that does exist.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it's really heartening that I can sit down and have these conversations because it does show that when we do talk about our experiences, despite the however many thousands of kilometers separate us, they're basically the same. And I really that is heartening because it shows that, this is not something that like I have to, these are not issues that I have to struggle with alone, that I have like comrades wherever I go, even halfway across the world, that are also looking for answers, and they might find something that I can then use and to try and derive some kind of solution, some kind of insight of my own, which I think is incredibly important. I know, Joe, you keep bringing up the Fukuyama view of history. I would just call it neoliberal. And as I think we're all aware, the logic of neoliberalism is basically or alienation, the constant march to atomize every single human being into their own sovereign entity, basically, which is simply unworkable if we want to preserve any normal parts of human nature. So I think when we do talk to each other and we do open up about our problems and we recognize how our experiences are so similar, we are doing something very significant in fighting back against this atomization, against this kind of pull to make everything about just us, about just our nation or our community, but are actually looking beyond that and saying, well, no, we're all people. We all have the same shit to look forward to.
Yeah, and I guess I'll have my own final kind of thoughts on this, and then we'll get into the book section. For me, I mentioned Fukuyama a lot, I know, and yeah, neoliberal is just I think more people will identify with, but it's the idea that I think for me, I've seen this being essentially internalized and rendered hegemonic, to use that Gramscian term, basically across the board, almost regardless of how people identify politically. Like sometimes I've seen even like far right folks in Europe kind of speak like they're just self-starter, and they have a startup and they want to be entrepreneurs essentially. Like it's something that it's, and not to downplay the threat of actual fascism, which is kind of a separate thing, but part of that space as well. But it's something that I've seen make like a lot of leftism, to use that ism term, just really dumb. Like I've seen just so much discourse that is just so ridiculously simplistic that almost if you bring up anything, it's almost like you feel like you're the party pooper and you don't want to, you're like being the inconvenient truth, to use that other term essentially. And I've seen this a lot, in Switzerland it's very common, and in the UK where I used to live it's very common. It's not just common in the West as well. As I said, in Lebanon there's still a blind spot when it comes to the Assad regime, I would argue, even among people who are not pro-Assad necessarily, but they don't understand the specificity of why there was an uprising in revolution in 2011 and arguably ongoing, and why there was this thing and why this thing changed things essentially. Like why it's not just a matter, and I guess we can see this, although it's very different, or at least partly different when it comes to the pandemic, this urge to go back to normality, as if like the past 2 years have just been this aberration that we just need to kind of forget, or it was complicated, it was not nice. And now we can go back to 2019 as if 2020 and 2021 and 2022 haven't happened, essentially. And this urge to go back to normal, quote unquote, all of this is in quotation, I think informs a lot of how most folks, whether they call themselves left-wing, conservatives, liberals, what have you, how they approach a lot of the world. And I think specifically as people who are on the left, in as much as that term has any relevance anymore, at least any usage, not relevant, but any usage anymore, it should be about like being a critical, providing critical eyes, essentially, or critical thoughts, or critical thinking, I mean, to that end, essentially. So that's what I would add to that. And on that note of asking people to be critical and to maybe read more, what are 3 books that each of you would recommend, and why those 3? And go for it.
Sure, I'll go first. So I'll recommend a book that I edited with comrades from Lausanne. It's called Reorienting Hong Kong's Resistance, Leftism, Decoloniality, and Internationalism. So the book kind of deal with a lot of the issue we talked about today. So Hong Kong is also facing multiple colonialism, right? And it's also, so like in the anti-elect movement, a lot of tankies will kind of point to Hong Konger raising the British flag as a way of, well, the movement has been corrupted by, the foreign regime. So we're kind of dealing with that issue from local activists, but also not subsumed to a kind of reductionist localism. And Brian also has a chapter in the book that talks about the problematic link of today's Hong Kong, tomorrow Taiwan, and how can we build sort of more productive solidarity from the nuances. So I highly recommend the book.
Yeah, I guess I'll go next. That's a tough question. Yeah, I recently revisited People's Republic of Amnesia by Louisa Lim. So that was regarding Tiananmen Square kind of commemorations, but also the historical forgetting in the ways that that's been enforced in China, or with regards to, for example, how the memory of Tiananmen Square is remembered. For example, there was the focus on the students in the square, but that was not the only thing that was happening. There were workers. There's also events outside of Beijing, for example, in Chengdu and other places. And that kind of memory has been just sort of, kind of wiped out in some sense because there's such focus on Beijing. So that is something interesting to read. I'm also reading Impossible City by Karen Chung, which is about Hong Kong today and the kind of losses that are occurring in Hong Kong. But I'm on like page 2, so that's just starting on that.
Karen is going to be a guest on in a couple of weeks, actually, to talk about that book.
Oh.
I didn't know about Reorienting Hong Kong's Resistance. Okay, so this is going to be in next episode for sure. I'll find a way to get the book, and I'll be in touch when to. We'll see if I have you on again, and maybe some of the other editors as well. We'll see. Okay, well, on that note, thank you, Brian, thank you, Wen, and Romeo. Thanks again for co-hosting, and this was fantastic chat, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Defy These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/FireTheseTimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.